This lecture video is for part 1 of chapter 9. So we're going to go over a few concepts and that you can follow along with your note sheet as well as we go here. So chapter 9 basically talks about market equilibrium and product price in imperfect competition. So we're going to review what perfect competition is, we're going to define and look at what imperfect competition is, and then we're going to look at 3 examples of imperfect competition, which are monopolistic, oligopoly, and monopoly. Just to review, perfect competition must satisfy all of these conditions. For a firm to exist or for products to exist in perfect competition, we need a large number of sellers producing a homogeneous product that is exactly the same, and a large number of buyers purchasing that product. One example is milk. Another one is corn, beef. A lot of our agricultural commodity products are those products that are not really differentiated from one to another. They just are what they are. And we would consider those perfect competition. Now, perfect competition doesn't necessarily exist in reality, and we'll kind of talk about why a little bit later. But so that's one condition. The second condition is that there is no single buyer or seller that has a disproportionate influence on price. So prices in perfect competition markets are strictly determined by supply and demand. The producers don't just say, okay, I'm going to sell my milk today for $5, or that's not a good price, for $20 per hundredweight. Okay, they don't set their price. They take what the market is offering based off of supply and demand. Now, again, we do have governmental intervention in some of that to make sure the price doesn't fall too low. But again, that's to discuss later. So the third part to fulfill perfect competition is that information is available to all participants regarding prices, sources of supply, quality, etc. So there's no hidden information from anybody that's trying to produce in perfect competition. And then finally, there's no barriers to entry or exit, meaning that anybody can start producing this product. There's not advantages for large producers. There's not government policies that keep people out or help people in. So an example of this could be a hot dog stand. Anybody can start a hot dog stand. So again, we know with agriculture, the larger producers do have advantages because of economy of scale issues. The larger they get, the cheaper they can source their products and their inputs and things like that. So perfect competition is kind of a fantasy world, but the closest products that we can really get to perfect competition are some of these agricultural products that we've talked about. So imperfect competition is different. Imperfect competition exists where the price of a product is not completely determined on supply and demand. The people who produce the product have the ability to set a price to an extent. Okay, so they don't just take the price that the market is offering because their product is differentiated in some way. So they've created a product that is different than really anything else. So it's not homogeneous, and they are able to help set that to set the price to the consumers. So there are 3 types of imperfect competition: monopolistic, oligopoly, and monopoly. And we're going to talk about each one of these individually. So monopolistic basically has a lot of the similar characteristics to perfect competition, but the product has been differentiated in some way. So I know I used the example of milk earlier, but so milk might be milk, like Great Value milk might actually come from the same processing plant as Dean's milk or as Prairie Farms milk, or at least from similar producers doing the same types of things and meeting the same types of standards. But Dean's milk and Prairie Farms milk, they have marketed themselves in a way that is differentiated, whether that be through their labels, whether that be through their advertising, their commercialing, the things that they put out that way. So just by putting a different label on, just by we see a glass bottle here in one of these pictures. So just by putting your milk in a glass bottle, you maybe have differentiated yourself, and you can, charge a little bit more. Another example is coffee. You'd think coffee is coffee, but it's not, and there's different prices for different brands of coffee. There's a little bit different ways to process it. There's different ways to advertise it. There's different ways to market it to the consumer. So they have been differentiated through branding, advertising, or potentially the taste or the protein content or the roasting effects, or something has been slightly modified so that they then can exert a control over price and potentially charge a little bit more. So when a company is able to charge a little bit more for their product due to this differentiation, we call them a price maker. Okay, so they're no longer a price taker, but rather they're a price maker or a price setter. So it might not necessarily be true that the products are different, but if there is a perceived difference, consumers might pay more for the product. For example, we have these two cans of green beans here. Very easily could have come from the same exact processing plant, but a different label was put on them, and one even says non-GMO. Well, guess what? There are no green beans that are genetically modified. So every single can of green beans could say non-GMO, but Del Monte decided to advertise that on their can, so maybe they can now charge a little bit more for the consumers. So this is an interesting quote here that just basically says the more differentiated a product becomes in the mind of buyers, the more opportunity the supplier has to raise the price of the product, taking advantage of buyers' perceptions concerning its unique characteristics. It's not necessary that these perceived differences be real. Product differentiation perceived by consumers may be due entirely to well-planned and well-executed advertising campaigns. So if a consumer thinks something is better, they might pay a higher price for it, even if in reality that product is the same as the great value product sitting on the shelf. So that's a way that we can completely differentiate a product through advertising and marketing, even if the product is completely the same. A couple more quotes. The better a business is at product differentiation, the greater the influence it has on price. So the more different that a product can seem or make itself or advertise itself, the more likely it's going to be able to set its own price at a higher price. Again, if a business can make their product seem like one of a kind, they can charge potentially quite a bit more than something that might be exactly the same, but doesn't have that different feel. So the second type of marketing or market that can exist in an imperfect competition is oligopoly. So oligopoly is different from monopolistic, because monopolistic, there are still a lot of different options. So as far as coffee goes and as far as milk goes, there's a lot of different brands, and it's a little bit easier to start like a coffee company than it would be to start one of these companies that fit into the category of oligopoly. So there's fewer sellers in the oligopoly market. So there's fewer companies producing the same product. A couple examples, and there's still lots of buyers. Okay, so a couple examples we have here in the agricultural world would be like the chemical supply companies that I have here listed on top. So there's a couple big names of chemical companies that provide the fertilizer and the herbicides and the insecticides and the fungicides and seeds, a lot of the inputs to crop producers. Okay, so these are like companies that just a few big names in that field. Okay, you can't go to Walmart and buy these products. Okay, these are there are special dealerships that are set up to sell these products. Another example with that, if unrelated to agriculture, would be like the airline industry. So you can kind of think of a few, American Airlines, Southwest Airlines, Spirit Airlines. You can kind of think of a few big names, United Airlines, of people that operate and sell plane tickets. You can't just go anywhere to the corner gas station and buy a plane ticket. Okay, so a few big sellers and still lots of buyers. Another example would be people who sell agricultural equipment. So New Holland, Case International, John Deere, few big names that sell a similar product. Cell phone companies are another one. We have AT&T, we have US Cellular, we have Verizon, we have Sprint, but you can't think of too many more cell phone companies. So these are all selling essentially a very similar product. So these companies need to differentiate their product through non-price in non-price ways. Okay, so they're probably all cost about the same for the product. Now there could be some differentiation, but that price kind of levels out. The price kind of remains stable over time because these companies still need to make a profit, so they can't set their price too low, but they also can't charge more because eventually, if they're charging too much, the customers are going to switch from one company to the next. So how do they become competitive, and how do you say, okay, I'm going to buy my phone service through US Cellular instead of Verizon, or vice versa? Well, they differentiate their product through non-price competition ways. So this could be through their customer service. So maybe you say, oh, US Cellular has super friendly customer service. Every single time I call, my questions get answered and they're always so helpful. That might be worth you going to them over Verizon. Delivery options. This might be more applicable for potentially those agricultural companies. You have sales representatives that are selling the seed and chemical, and if they are, super willing to deliver this product to you when you need it, where you need it, seamlessly all the time, that's providing a better customer service than one of the other companies potentially. Timeliness, I kind of already talked about that. So these products are not differentiated necessarily because they're selling super different products, but they're differentiated through customer service, timeliness, delivery options, some of those kind of non-tangible benefits. And again, that's called non-price competition. Those ways are categorized as non-price competition. So it can be high barriers. In general, imperfect competition has higher barriers to enter into than perfect competition, but this has higher barriers than monopolistic because these are big companies that require huge capital costs, and the bigger the company gets, the cheaper they're going to be able to source inputs. So a little business or a little firm just starting out is going to have a hard time keeping up with them. And then that absolute unit cost advantage is just how much it costs them to make, let's say, one tractor or one planter, versus how much it would cost some startup company to make one tractor or one planter. So they have really low cost per unit of production just because their company is so large. And again, I already mentioned that the price does remain stable among these companies over time, and that's why they need to differentiate themselves through their customer service and so forth. Again, just a reminder that cell phone companies fall into that category as well. Okay. The last one I want to talk about is monopoly. So that's where there's one seller in the market. So ComEd could be an example of this, where really there's only one electrical company in this area that we are able to get our electric service through. So this has the highest barriers of entry of all of the of all of the imperfect competitive markets. And it's really just, again, where there's one seller in the market. So how then do we discover, or how do firms within imperfect markets set their prices? How do they decide what they're going to charge? And how do they decide how many products they're going to create or offer, the quantity? So how do we figure out the price and the quantity, the price at which to sell the product for, and the amount to produce when we exist in imperfect markets? We're going to take a look at that. So before we figure out price and quantity for firms in an imperfect market, let's recall price and quantity for perfect competition. So we did supply and demand curves before, and this is an image of the market demand curve and the market supply curve. So this is the entire market. So this is the thousands and thousands of producers and the thousands and thousands of hundreds of millions of buyers in perfect competition. So this could be for buying corn, for buying beef, for buying milk. So the market equilibrium is set where supply meets demand. So where supply meets demand, that's the price that will be in the market, and we follow it down to see the quantity that would be produced. This is the supply and demand curve for the market. So if the market, for whatever reason, increased the price, so if we increase the price, the demand would be less and the supply would be more, and we would actually have a surplus. If we decrease the price, the supply would be less, so people would be willing to produce less for a lower price, and the demand would be high because everything's cheap, so there would actually be a shortage there, but we'll look at that a little bit later too. Okay, so for a firm, this is an individual firm's demand curve. If you recall, is going to be perfectly elastic, which means that it's perfectly horizontal. So what this shows is that if an individual firm, so let's say an individual dairy farmer says, nope, I'm going to sell my milk for $25 a hundredweight. If they raise their price, nobody is going to buy that, okay? Just the slightest bit if they raise their price because it's cheaper, the market price is cheaper. If they lower their price just a teeny tiny bit, a ton of more people will buy it. So the more horizontal the demand curve is, the more sensitive the market is to changes in price. Okay, so I believe one of your questions asks you to draw a demand curve for a single firm. That's going to be that horizontal line, and then for a demand curve for an entire market, your demand curve is going to slope downward because it's just basically saying that the higher the prices, the less quantity is going to be demanded, and then the lower the prices, the higher the demand is going to be. So here's just an example of the demand curve along with some other curves. But again, it's just reiterating the fact that a firm's demand curve is this horizontal line across here, and it is the same as the product price, okay, because our product price over here is $45. It's the same as the average revenue because, and it's the same as the marginal revenue because the firm will get $45 every single time. So marginal revenue, the amount that they're going to make for an additional unit, will be $45 every single time because the price stays the same. The average revenue is going to be $45 because every unit of revenue is $45. So for this one, you're just circling that horizontal line to kind of understand that point, that all of those numbers are the same for an individual firm's demand demand in perfect competition. Imperfect competition, however, is not horizontal. So for an individual firm, so this is an individual firm's demand curve in imperfect competition, okay? Because our products are differentiated, we're not part of a larger market curve, okay? Because we're selling a product that is different than a lot of people, whether it's different through service, whether it's different through advertising, or whatever it may be. So the individual firm's demand curve looks similar to the market demand curve for perfect competition. So the individual firm's demand curve in imperfect competition slopes downward. Okay, so the higher, so if we think about this in terms of like Starbucks coffee, because Starbucks, they've differentiated themselves. It's not the same as a Folgers cup of coffee or as a Great Value cup of coffee, but the more expensive their coffee is, the less that's going to be demanded. The cheaper their coffee is, the more that's going to be demanded. So we're looking at the demand curve again here for a firm in imperfect competition, and we're looking at it at different price points, okay? So if the price, let's still use coffee, if the price of coffee, a Starbucks coffee, is $12, the demand will be 6. So only 6 people are going to buy a coffee for $12. If, however, that coffee price drops to $3, now 25 people want a cup of that coffee. So this is the demand curve. It also works out to be the average revenue at any point, at any quantity point. So that's how we can calculate profit, because they're selling 20, here we're selling at $6, we're selling 20 of them. So the average revenue at that point is $6. And it also works out to be the price, as I just said, because it gives us the price. So this is the demand, the price, and the average revenue. That line, however, is not the marginal revenue. Each additional unit of Starbucks coffee that is sold is done so by decreasing the price, okay? So in order to sell more, so in order to sell 15 instead of 10, we had to decrease the price from, let's say, 10 to 8. So that means marginal revenue is the amount of money that you get for each additional sale. It's going to decrease every single time, because in order for us to sell another cup of coffee, we have to decrease our price. So our marginal revenue curve is different in an imperfectly competitive market compared to a perfectly competitive market. So our marginal revenue curve sits outside of the demand curve. This slide just sort of summarizes what we talked about previously. Marginal revenue is not constant, and demand curve is not perfectly elastic. So we have both a downward sloping demand curve and marginal revenue curve. So we can actually calculate the amount of total revenue and marginal revenue at each quantity that is sold utilizing this graph. So let's go ahead and do that. So at a price of 15 and a quantity of 0, our total revenue, so at $15, we're selling 0 coffee. So our total revenue at that point is 0, and our marginal revenue is also actually not able to be calculated at this point, because it's change in total revenue divided by change in quantity, and we only have 1 point so far. So at a price of 14 and a quantity of 2, our total revenue is just going to be, we sold 2 at $14, so that's going to be 28, and we'll come back to marginal revenue. Let's get all the total revenues calculated out here. So price and quantity, so if our price is 13 and the quantity that we sold is 4, so we just need to do 13 times 4, which is 52. For the next one, our price is 12 and we sold 6, so 12 times 6 is 72. Next one, 11 times 8 is 88. Okay, let's calculate a couple of these marginal revenues. So marginal revenue, again, is the amount that we will sell the next unit for. So it's the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. So from this step to this step, our change in total revenue is 28 minus 0, which is 28, divided by the change in quantity. So we went from 0 to 2, so that's 2. So 28 divided by 2 is 14, which that makes sense. We sold the next cup of coffee, the next 2 cups of coffee for 14. As we continue to sell more coffee, let's see what some of these look like. So we want to calculate the next marginal revenue. We are going to do 52 minus 28 divided by 4 minus 2. So 52 minus 28 is 24. Oops. Divided by 2, that is 12. Whoops, that's 26. I'm sorry. 52 minus 28. No, that is 24. So that's going to be 12. And let's do one more here, and then I'll let you do the rest by yourself. So we have 72 minus 52, which is 20, divided by 6 minus 4. So we have 72 minus 52 divided by 6 minus 4. So that is 20 divided by 2, which equals 10. 10. So the amount of money that we are getting for the next one is the marginal revenue. Okay, so we can see that as the price decreases, which makes sense, our marginal revenue is going to decrease. And then as the quantity is increasing, our marginal revenue is also decreasing, because the lower that we set our price, the more that's going to be demanded. So that's going to result in our marginal revenue decreasing. Okay, so then we can come over here and we can make a marginal revenue curve. So we can put our, we can plot our marginal revenue curve. So it says plot the total revenue curve with the quantity produced. I don't care which you put where here, but I'll put quantity on the bottom and then I'll put revenue on the top. So our quantity goes from 0 to 28. So let's see how many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, it's going to be close. So let's just do 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24. We'll have one that's off the screen. Actually, a couple. All right, so our quantity, and then plot that with our marginal revenue. Oh, total revenue. So our total revenue, we're going to start with, going to have to see how high that goes, but 0 is going to start with, I'm going to do 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. You will probably have to change the dimensions of this. I'm not going to do the whole thing out here with you, but I'm going to get you started. So at 0, we're making $0. When we sell 2, we are making $28. When we sell 6, we are making $72. Oops, I skipped 4. 4, we're making 52. 6, 72, 8, 88. So what you're going to start to see here is that it's probably going to eventually level off. Okay, but go ahead and check that out and see what you get there. So hopefully what you saw in that previous slide is that the graph eventually started to actually decrease. So we use these calculations to help us figure out in a imperfect competition, what points to produce at, because we obviously don't want to produce at a point where we're losing money when we sell more, right? So we're going to do a couple examples of where a monopolistic firm would figure out how the price and quantity at which they would produce and sell. So remember, monopolistic is they are similar products, but they are differentiated in some way. So this can be lots of different coffee brands or lots of different milk brands, and they are a price maker to a certain extent. So if we are looking at this graph here, I'm telling you that the profits of this firm are the area that exists right here. So let's just say this is 8, this is 10, just so we can put some units with this. And this is, we'll say 10. So I'm basically telling you that the profits are the area of this little blue box, which would be, the height of this is 2 and the quantity is 10, so I'm saying it would be $200. So I'm asking you, why is that the case? Okay, so first we need to remember a couple things. That profit maximizing point is where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost curve. So let's locate those two curves to start. So the marginal revenue curve is right here. Marginal cost curve is right here. So where those 2 points meet each other is at that red dot. And so the price that is going to be charged at this, so this is the quantity that we are going to produce, and I said that was 10. So we got to first find that dot, then we got to follow it down to figure out the quantity that's going to be produced. Then we got to follow it up at that quantity. How much can we charge? Well, we have to follow that up to the demand curve, because the demand curve is what the market is telling us people will pay. If we're only producing 10, we can follow that up to the demand curve to see what we can charge for those 10. Okay, and I said before that was going to be $10. So if we're producing 10 and we're charging $10, we are bringing in $100. Okay, but what is this costing us? All right, so we need to figure out, what does this cost us to produce? What do those 10 units cost us to produce? Well, we again follow this quantity up to the average total cost curve, which meets it right about here. This is the average total cost curve. And then we follow that over, and I told you that was 8. So it's costing us $8 per unit to make those 10. So 10 times 8 is, it's going to cost us $80. So if we're bringing in $100 and it's costing us $80, what we are profiting is $20. My math was wrong earlier. I said 200, but it's 20. Okay, so our profits are $20. So we kind of have to be able to read these graphs. Okay, we're going to do another example. So explain why the firm's loss is equal to the shaded blue rectangle. So again, first thing, the profit maximizing point is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Here's marginal cost, here's marginal revenue. So this is the point at which we will produce. Q. All right. So let's give that a number. We'll do 10 again, just because. Okay, so we're going to produce 10. We need to figure out, what is that going to cost us to produce, and how much revenue will we get from that. So profit equals revenue minus cost. Okay. So the revenue that we are going to receive from these 10, again, we follow this up to the demand curve, because this is what people are willing to pay. Once we hit the demand curve, we follow it over to see what this reading is. Let's say this is 13. Okay, so quantity was 10. We were able to sell them for $13 a piece. So 10 times 13 is 130. So our revenue is 130. Our cost, in order to find the cost at that quantity, we have to follow it all the way up to the average total cost curve. Once we hit the average total cost curve, we follow that horizontally over to see what that value is. Okay, I'm going to say that value is 15. So now it costs us $15 to make 10 of them, or it costs $15 a piece to make each of the 10, because that's the average total cost curve. So it's going to cost us $150. So we're bringing in 130. We are, it's costing us 150. So our loss is going to be $20, which 15 minus 13. So this is 2 times 10, and that's $20 inside of there. So that's how you figure out the profit and the loss and the profit maximizing point of a monopolistic curve. Okay, that should help you with a couple of problems on your notes. Okay, take a minute to look at this video. This video is going to show you sort of what happens to a monopolistic market in the short run compared to the long run. And then I'm going to want you to label which one of these graphs is a short run view and which one of them is a long run view, and then kind of explain why they're different on your note sheet. So the video touched on this, but we'll just kind of re-explain it here. As far as the long run equilibrium for a monopolistic firm, they're basically going to have a profit of 0. And the reason being, if we kind of work through this, the profit maximizing point is still where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So that's going to give us this quantity. We'll label it 10 again. Now, if we follow 10 up to the demand curve, which is right here, the price that people will pay at that quantity is, let's give it a price of 20. Okay, so again, we know profit equals revenue minus cost. So revenue here, if we are producing 10 and we're selling them for $20, 10 times 20 is 200. So revenue is 200. What is going to cost us? Well, we have to find the average total cost curve, and then we have to follow quantity up until we meet the average total cost curve. That is it's tangent to the demand curve at this point. So it's also going to be $20. So we produce 10, each of them costs us $20 to produce, that's going to be $200. So our cost is $200. So there's no profit at this point because the cost is equal to the revenue. So 200 minus 200 is 0. So all of that was how a monopolistic firm would set their price and figure out the quantity that they're going to sell. Oligopolies work a little bit different. So remember, oligopolies are where there are few sellers, the big names, and there's lots and lots of buyers. So oligopoly price can be set in one of two ways. One, there can be a price leader. So one of the firms in the oligopoly, probably the one that has the largest share of the market, sets a price. They just kind of figure out how they're going to maximize their profits, and then everybody else follows. Because they're selling similar products like a cell phone company or airline tickets or chemical and seed companies, if one company raises their prices, they're going to lose customers to the company that has a very similar product at lower prices. So having a price leader and then everybody else kind of following suit is one way that oligopolies set their price. Another way that oligopolies set their price is an illegal way, which is through price fixing or collusion. So basically they're communicating with each other and they're telling each other, or they're making a plan, like the different companies are talking to each other and saying, what are you going to charge for this year? What are you going to charge? And they can elevate the price that way. They can say, well, if we both charge instead of us both charging $20, we both charge $25, then we'll make more money and they can't get it anywhere else, so we'll both make more money. So that's kind of like illegal conversations that are being had, which is, again, illegal. So here's a short video on price fixing, and I do want you to take a minute to click that link and go ahead and watch that, and that'll help you answer question 18 on your note sheet, which is, what is a cartel and how is it related to price fixing, and then answer the question as to whether cartels are legal. Couple price fixing articles. I would like you to take a minute to select one of these. So this link will take you to several different articles in pretty recent cases. This happens all the time. Price fixing, again, I said, is an illegal thing that is happening. So click on that Google Doc link and choose one of those articles to read about a company that has gotten in legal trouble for price fixing, and then summarize the article by providing the who, what, where, when, why, and how, as you see on number 19 on your note sheet. So monopolists set their prices in yet a little bit different way, and we're going to look at that here quickly. So just to recall, monopolies are where there's one seller in the market, and electric companies are an example of that. So a monopoly sets its price a little bit different than monopolistic or oligopoly because they're the only firm in the market. So really, they could set their price higher than what it, and they do set their price higher than what it would exist under perfect competition. Because their price is higher than how it would exist under perfect competition, the amount sold then is going to be a little bit lower than how it would exist in perfect competition, because again, it's more expensive. And also because the monopolist has no competitors, their prices would be higher than it would occur under an oligopoly as well. So in practice, though, monopolists really don't charge as much as they possibly could, because they don't want to encourage other companies from trying to figure out a way to enter the market and charge a lower price, because that would ultimately mess with their profits. And there are some antitrust legal things that they need to follow as well. So they tend to, figure out what the maximum that they could set their price at and then go a little bit below that. But the graphs that we're going to look at are going to help us to figure out how a monopolist could maximize its profits. So how a monopolist would maximize their profits would be, first of all, operating at the quantity where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So let's find marginal cost, marginal revenue. So they would operate at this quantity, but they're not going to set their price at that point, because as with the monopolistic graphs that we saw, instead they're going to follow this up to the demand curve, which is right here, and they're going to set their price at that point, because they know that producing that quantity allows them to be able to charge this price. So what they are then charging is going to help us figure out the profits here. So let's put a couple numbers to this to help us. I know I keep using 10. I'm going to do 20 over here. So again, profits equals revenue minus cost. So our revenue, we're producing 10 and they're charging 20. 10 times 20 is 200. So our revenue is 200. And that would be, the area of this entire rectangle. Our average total cost of Q, so if we follow that up to the average total cost is right here. So we're going to call that 15. So our average total cost is $15 per unit, and we're producing 10 of them. So 10 times 15 equals 150. So our profit in this case is going to be 50. And this whole thing is going to be our profit. Nope, sorry. This whole thing is going to be our profit because these are all of our costs, okay? So, so again, our profit is going to be 50. So if we have to label a couple things. So total fixed cost, total variable costs, and profit. So let's clear that off. I have the profit labeled there. So our variable cost curve is right here. So these are going to be our total variable costs. And then if you remember, variable costs plus fixed costs equals total cost. So this area in here is going to be our fixed costs. Okay. So this slide just gives us kind of a summary of all of the different competitive market types, along with some characteristics of them. So just sort of review, you know, how many buyers and sellers are there? Are the products differentiated? Is it easy to enter or exit? How is price determined and quantity determined? So these are the graphs. So for monopolistic, this is kind of what we did to figure that out. For monopoly, that's what we did to figure that out. Oligopoly, remember it's mostly done by a price leader. Well, we could put price leader in here. Or price fixing. And then perfect competition is set by demand and supply curves. Do the sellers have the ability to set the market price? Is there going to be long run profits? And then what are some examples of each of these? Okay, so that sort of summarizes. And this is actually an example out of your textbook. It's number 1, and that's part of what's assigned for you for this week. So what we can do, or what we can figure out here, is the short run equilibrium price and quantity. So under both a monopolistic and a monopoly market, producers will supply at the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This point, this output, this Q will maximize their profits. Okay, so let's first find the point on this graph where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So it doesn't look like this, but marginal revenue is actually this slanted line here. Okay, so that's marginal revenue. Here's our marginal cost curve. Marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect right there. That is at Q equals 20. So the quantity that would be being produced at this point is 20 units. Now, producers will price their product where the quantity aligns with the market demand curve. So we are not going to price our product at $13 because we can get more, because our market, if we have a quantity of 20, they are willing to pay $20 for each of those 20 units. So I followed this up to the demand curve. So this red line here is the demand curve. After I found my Q, I followed that up to the demand curve. And then where the Q hits the demand curve, and you go horizontally across, this is the amount that they're going to charge. So the amount that they are going to charge is different than where marginal cost intersects with marginal revenue. Okay, I'm going to erase this quick, and actually I'm going to go through the questions exactly in the book for number 1. Let me turn to that page quick. Okay, so letter A says, what price is charged by the monopolist in order to maximize profits? So we already figured out that we are going to produce where MC equals MR, so we're going to produce at 20. Then we're going to follow that up to the price that intersects the demand curve, which is over here at $20. So A What price is charged by the monopolist in order to maximize profits? $20. Okay, B says calculate the total revenue accruing to the monopolist at the profit maximizing output. This is the profit maximizing output. So they are selling 20 units for $20, right? Here's our $20, here's our 20 units. So our total revenue that we are bringing in is 20 times 20, which is $400 for revenue. Calculate the total cost to the monopolist at the profit maximizing output. So cost at this output. So wherever this output intersects with the average total cost, so if we are producing 20 units, our average total cost is right there, because that's where 20 units intersects with the average total cost. So our average total cost is 15. So C says calculate the total cost to the monopolist at the profit maximizing output. So it costs for each unit, it costs $15 to produce, and we are producing 20 of them. So the total cost is going to be 15 times 20, which is $300. D, calculate the profit for the monopolist. Well, profit equals revenue minus total cost. So 400 minus 300 is 100. And that's what this area is here. The difference between 20 and 15 is $5. And then we're selling 20 of them too. So 20 times 5 is 100. So we can double check it both ways. E says calculate the total variable cost and fixed costs of the monopolist at the profit maximizing output. Okay, I'm going to erase some of this. Okay, total variable costs and total fixed costs at profit maximizing output. Okay, we already know that our profit maximizing output is 20. And our average variable costs intersect right here. So our average variable cost is 12. And again, we're producing 20 units. So 12 times 20 is $240. So that would be our total variable. So total variable equals 240. And then total fixed. Well, we see our fixed costs. Okay, well, there's not a fixed cost curve here, but there is a total cost curve. And we know our total costs are $15. And if our total costs are 15, average total costs are 15, average variable costs are 12. So we know that variable cost plus fixed costs equals 15. So variable cost is 12 plus X equals 15, and then that's a difference of 3. So our average fixed cost is 3, the difference here, times our 20 units. So our average fixed cost is $60, which makes sense because our total costs are 300. Okay, F, now assume the marginal cost curve represents market supply for a perfectly competitive market. What would the equilibrium price and quantity be for perfect competition? So let's erase all this again to get us some space here. Okay. So they're saying, imagine that the marginal cost curve is the supply curve, right? And if we remember the point of the marginal, so this is the supply curve, and we have our demand curve. So the point where the demand curve meets the supply curve, this would be normally where we would be supplying. We would normally be supplying at an output of 28, and we would be charging a price of about $15.75, it looks like. So the question is, what would the equilibrium price and quantity be for perfect competition? Q would be 28, and price would be approximately $15.75. The last question, are consumers better off or worse off with perfect competition or monopoly? We are going to get into that next week. So you can skip that portion of the question for this week, and we will look at that next week.